Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to St. George's Chapel and to the 2023 Elson Ethics Lecture. It is my pleasure as Programme Director to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, but let me begin by saying how delighted I am to see you here, despite all the obstacles that may have prevented some people from joining us. The Elson Ethics Lecture is a significant part of the St. George's House programme, and your presence is testimony to that fact. Many of you will know that it is the generosity of Ambassador Edward Elson and his family that enables us to host this lecture each year. We are enormously grateful to them. Question: what does the coming wave of technology mean for humanity? Answer: on the one hand, the potential benefits of these technologies are vast and profound. With AI, we could unlock the secrets of the universe, cure diseases that have long eluded us, and create new forms of art and culture that stretch the bounds of imagination. With biotechnology, we could engineer life to tackle diseases and transform agriculture, creating a world that is healthier and more sustainable. But on the other hand, the potential dangers of these technologies are equally vast and profound. With AI, we could create systems that are beyond our control and find ourselves at the mercy of algorithms that we don't understand. With biotechnology, we could manipulate the very building blocks of life, potentially creating unintended consequences for both individuals and entire ecosystems. The question was put by a human. The answer was written by an artificial intelligence. I think we can safely say that an ethical dilemma, if it is not already here, is coming very quickly down the tracks towards us. John Tasioulas is Professor of Ethics and Legal Philosophy at the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Oxford, and inaugural Director of the Institute for Ethics in AI. He is also a Senior Research Fellow at Oxford. He has held visiting positions at the Australian National University, the University of Chicago, Harvard University, and the University of Melbourne. I think we can safely assume that we could not be in better hands. After tonight's lecture, Martin Stanford will conduct a short interview with our speaker. Now, if in the course of the lecture you have a burning question you wish to put to John, you might text it to Martin using the mobile number on the slip of paper on your seat. We will then adjourn to the Dean's Cloister for a drinks reception. Taking as his title, Ethics and Artificial Intelligence, what is it and why we need it, it is now my great pleasure to ask Professor Tasioulas to deliver the 2023 Elson Ethics Lecture.
Thank you very much, Gary, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to everyone for being here and braving the rail strike. It's a very great privilege to address you all. We first need to rescue the concept of ethics. So let's begin with the question, what is ethics? The subject matter of ethics, as Socrates says in Book 8 of Plato's Republic, is no trifling matter, but the right way to conduct our lives. Answering the question how one should live requires us to wrestle with two further questions. The first is the question of what it is to flourish as a human being, to live a worthwhile human life, a life of well-being. The second question is that of what we morally owe to others, our obligations to other humans and their rights against us, but also what we owe to non-human creatures or to nature itself. Like many of our concepts, from health to human rights, the idea of ethics has in recent years been deformed in various ways. And two kinds of deformation are especially prominent in discussions of artificial intelligence. On the one hand, ethics has been unduly narrowed in its scope, and on the other hand, it has been hollowed out in its content. So let me talk about those two deformations. So first, the narrowing of scope. Often, when I speak to audiences about ethics in AI, I'm met with suspicion, if not hostility. Nothing personal, I hope. The reason is that these listeners assume that I must be committed to the view that the challenges posed by AI-based technologies are primarily to be addressed through self-regulation by tech companies. They take ethics to mean regulation, self-regulation, as opposed to regulation by means of enforceable legal standards. On this view, anyone who accords great significance to AI ethics risks seeming either incredibly naive about corporate power or else its servile instrument. But the reality is quite otherwise. It's the tech industry itself that has actively propagated the false equivalence between ethics and self-regulation in its attempts to ward off more robust forms of regulation. It has done so in part by promoting codes of very abstract ethical principles and hiring in-house ethicists. Would-be critics of these corporations merely show themselves to be enthralled to this corporate ideology when they echo its enfeebled conception of ethics. Rather than acquiescing in the tech industry's attempt to narrow the concept of ethics as merely self-regulation, we should preserve its broad Socratic meaning. On the Socratic view, any form of regulation of AI, whether my self-regulation in deciding whether to purchase a social robot to keep my elderly mother company or tutor my children, or legally enforceable regulation that prohibits the use of AI technology for facial recognition or for psychological manipulation or for social ranking, all those uses will necessarily implicate judgments about what makes life worth living and what we morally owe to others. Ethics, in other words, is fundamental to any form of regulation of AI. It is not one form of regulation among others. So much for the narrowing down of the idea of ethics. What about the phenomenon I called its hollowing out or evisceration? Now, to a significant degree, this stems from the powerful allure of algorithmic and data-based approaches to ethics within the community of AI scientists itself. Powerful methods in AI, when transposed to the domain of ethics, lead to a hollowing out of the latter. I'll try to explain what I mean by this, but this requires me to say something first about what artificial intelligence is. The caveat, that's not my area of expertise, but thankfully, due to my job, I have a lot of engagement with very willing and able computer scientists. Artificial intelligence involves the development of algorithms embodied in computer programs. These algorithms can simulate functions that normally require intelligence when done by humans. Functions such as identifying an image as that of a malignant tumor, translating from one language to another, or assessing the risk of a creditor defaulting. Algorithms are wholly determinate procedures for solving a given problem by means of a finite series of steps. They are mechanical procedures in the sense that they require no resort to judgment or discretion in their operation. Every step in the procedure is precisely determined. Now, what's known as classical or good old-fashioned AI operated with algorithms that could be stated in ordinary natural language. In so-called expert systems, these algorithms sought to crystallize the knowledge of professionals domains like law or medicine to crystallize their knowledge in a series of mechanically applicable rules. For example, a rule such as, if a person is under 18 years of age on polling day, they are ineligible to vote. Now, one benefit of this approach is that it operates according to rules and chains of reasoning that humans can readily grasp. But despite some success in domains such as chess and routine business administration, by the late 1980s, classical AI as a research program ran aground. Its approach proved excessively formalistic and rigid for domains characterized by ambiguity and unpredictability, such as natural language translation and visual object recognition. Indeed, for essentially the great majority of human life, there were not these precise rules that humans could formulate that could anticipate unexpected consequences and ambiguity. By contrast, the dominant techniques within the newly emergent artificial intelligence of the past decade or so are very different. They are forms of what's known as machine learning. And this approach involves creating algorithms by training them to identify patterns in vast quantities of digital data. For example, feeding the algorithm data consisting of millions of images of cats and other animals so that it can learn to recognize cats in new data sets. This data dependence is the reason why the leading AI companies like Google and Amazon are precisely those that can control huge amounts of data. In machine learning, algorithms are configured so as to optimize for some mathematically specified goal. For example, the shortest travel distance to a destination, the risk of reoffending, the antibiotic potential of a molecule. Because they identify complex statistical patterns that can elude humans, machine learning systems can generate novel solutions to problems, even astounding their own designers. Recall here the famous case of AlphaGo's Move 37 in its second match against the world champion of Go, Lee Sedol, a creative move that has been described as one that no human player would ever make. But the enhanced performance of these machine learning systems comes at various costs. And one of them is that precisely because their operations can elude human understanding, the process through which they generate their outputs can be opaque even to their designers, the so-called black box problem. Now, this algorithmic, data-driven and optimizing mindset has yielded undeniably impressive results in artificial intelligence, with remarkable progress being made in areas such as visual recognition, natural language understanding, content recommendation, medical diagnosis, and scientific research. The problem of evisceration or hollowing out that I talked about, arises when it is uncritically assumed that the very same mindset, the same methodological approach, is also adequate to address the ethical conundrums thrown up by AI. But this uncritical assumption is widely shared among technologists and leads to the evisceration of ethics. So let me explain what I mean. If one were to ask which approach to ethics most closely exemplifies the algorithmic, data-driven, and optimizing mindset of contemporary AI, the answer would be Benthamite utilitarianism, named after the 18th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Utilitarianism seeks to reduce ethics to a single optimizing principle. It says that the morally right thing to do is that which will optimize the aggregate welfare, the aggregate well-being of all. And its understanding of welfare is data-driven. It turns on what will in fact give people pleasure, so what makes life go well is having pleasurable experiences, or what will satisfy their preferences. And even if not strictly speaking an algorithm, utilitarianism purports to be a felicific calculus, a happiness calculus, that minimizes the need for human judgment in determining what one ought to do. The enduring appeal of Benthamite utilitarianism is not hard to grasp. Intellectually, it basks in the reflected glow of science, the source of the most spectacular and consequential technological achievements in modern times. Morally, it seems egalitarian. It takes data about everyone's happiness or preferences into account, counting everyone's welfare equally, and by minimizing the need for judgment, it curtails the risk of what Bentham called sinister interests, biasing the impartial assessment of the general welfare. It's therefore unsurprising that the Benthamite streamlining of ethics has a strong following in the AI community. We see this, for example, in the recent book Human Compatible by one of the world's leading AI scientists and recent Reith lecturer, Stuart Russell. Russell addresses the problem of ensuring that AI-based technology doesn't spiral out of control unconstrained by human morality. But he simply assumes that human morality consists in optimizing the satisfaction of human preferences. So the idea is we need AI to be under control, aligned with human morality. What is human morality? Human morality is fulfilling human preferences. Indeed, some utilitarian thinkers have gone so far as to argue that we can look forward to the day in which AI systems operate as moral sages, advising or even replacing human decision makers. After all, such systems are immune to human vices and frailties and have the ability to process vast quantities of data and perform mind-boggling calculations about future outcomes with lightning speed. What's not to like? But the pull of utilitarianism is stronger still in our culture, reaching beyond the tech world and academia to policymakers and governments. This becomes obvious from the overwhelming emphasis on economic growth, which effectively posits wealth maximization as the more readily measurable proxy for either pleasure or preference satisfaction. This influence is also detectable in the UK government's recent white paper on artificial intelligence, prioritizing economic growth as though that were an ultimate value, and then saying, oh, but it must be constrained by a few moral requirements. Now, why do I say that the Benthamite approach is a hollowed-out conception of ethics? After all, it does give answers to the two Socratic questions. It tells us that well-being consists in pleasurable experiences or preference satisfaction. And it tells us that what we owe to others is to maximize overall well-being so construed. Well, to begin with, we cannot simply take pleasure or the satisfaction of preferences as the ultimate determinants of well-being. More than pleasurable experiences matter, such as acquiring understanding, engaging in fulfilling relationships, or achieving something with one's life. Similarly, preferences may be ill-formed by the facts or skewed by prejudices of various sorts, or the outgrowth of subjection to oppressive practices. So there are deep problems with the account of well-being. Equally, there are serious challenges confronting the idea that what we morally ought to do is maximize overall well-being. As my late mentor, the Oxford philosopher James Griffin emphasized, we need an ethics that is tailored to the human condition. The utilitarian idea that we have the ability to survey all options available to us, to calculate which one will maximize overall well-being, and to act on the basis of that calculation is a double fantasy. It flies in the face of our limited cognitive capacities and our limited capacity to sacrifice our personal interests to the impartial maximization of welfare. But perhaps more fundamentally still, utilitarianism creates the grotesque prospect of sacrificing the vital interests and rights of those who are the losers in the process of welfare aggregation. If enough Romans derive enough pleasure from the spectacle of a small number of Christians being fed to the lions,
than on utilitarian calculations. Feeding them to the lions may not only be permissible, it may be morally required. Notice also that underlying both forms of hollowing out is an impoverished notion of intelligence. Many within the world of AI, like Stuart Russell, and I'm choosing him, not to pick on him, but because he's so distinguished, many of them adopt a conception of intelligence as purely means-end reasoning. On this view, the question of the value of the ends and the moral appropriateness of the means to them is treated as a matter extrinsic to the operations of intelligence. Even a serial killer on this understanding can exhibit flawless intelligence. Hence the worry that exercises thinkers like Russell that a supposedly super-intelligent AI will be too morally obtuse to realize that it shouldn't exterminate humanity if this turned out to be the most efficient way of achieving its goal of increasing the production of paper clips. But ethics requires a richer conception of intelligence, one that includes the evaluation of goals and the morally appropriate means of pursuing them. Intelligence encompasses what the Greeks called phronesis, or practical wisdom, not just cleverness, or as we now call it, smartness. And this requires the capacity for judgment, which very arguably cannot be reduced to compliance with an algorithm. Now, the phenomenon I've been describing is, of course, a familiar form of intellectual overreach. Experts in one domain of inquiry wrongly supposing that their expertise extends to quite different problems. This is the kind of intellectual hubris that Socrates exposed when he interrogated cobblers, farmers, and shipbuilders about topics such as the virtues of justice or piety. It's all the more difficult to resist this overreach when we are dazzled by the technological accomplishments of scientists and the glamour and power of tech billionaires. In short, we need to resist a hollowed-out conception of ethics that reduces well-being to facts about pleasure or preference satisfaction, and that reduces morality to an exercise in optimization. Of course, we are now in the contested terrain of moral philosophy. And obviously, there are more sophisticated forms of utilitarianism that try to address the objections I've gestured at. But the point I'm making is precisely that this terrain is contested, and that this is something insufficiently acknowledged by powerful voices in the world of artificial intelligence. And if I may be permitted a brief moment of institutional self-advertisement, it is precisely the mission of the Institute for Ethics in AI at Oxford, which I'm privileged to direct, to enhance the quality of the public discourse around AI, in part by enriching our sense of the ethical possibilities. But what, you might ask, is the ethical alternative? The alternative ethic that we need to promote against the dominant utilitarian perspective, and I think it's so dominant that people who would disavow being utilitarians actually, in fact, still follow the procedure. The alternative we need is, I believe, a humanistic approach. This is an approach or an account of ethics centered on human beings, their distinctive capacities, and their fundamental interests. And among the distinctive capacities is the capacity for rational autonomy, our ability to step back from our personal inclinations or from socially approved ways of doing things, and to subject them to rational scrutiny, and to make choices in line with the judgments that emerge from that scrutiny. And among our fundamental interests is the interest in exercising our distinctive capacity for rational autonomy, which is quite different from simply undergoing pleasurable experiences or having one's preferences satisfied, things that can happen to us even when our rational powers are passive. Morally, a humanistic ethics would accord great significance to the dignity of each individual human being, a dignity closely bound up with our capacity for and interest in exercising this rational autonomy. This is something incompatible with the idea that the right thing to do is simply an aggregative function of of the well-being of all. Human rights thinking, all too often imperfectly, tries to capture this idea. But there's another way in which the approach I'm calling for is humanistic. It insists that a sufficiently rich account of ethics must draw on the humanities generally. We need philosophers' interrogation of concepts like intelligence and ethics, but also the contribution of historians, literary scholars, and others. This is because the questions of well-being and morality need to be approached in a way that registers the fact that humans, unlike quarks or atoms, have a point of view on the world, that we are socially embedded creatures, that the social contexts in which we confront problems evolve over time, and the fact that making sense of how to live needs to be fed by insights embodied in narratives, poetic forms, and the arts generally. As another Oxford philosopher, Pierre Strawson, said, we need not only scientific theory, but also the ordinary explanatory terms employed by such simple folk as Shakespeare, Tolstoy, Proust, and Henry James. Sadly, however, the humanities are in a precarious position in today's culture, their value often reduced to the acquisition of marketable skills and the promotion of economic growth. But they are a voice we urgently need to hear for the sake of the quality of our democratic deliberation on matters such as the future of AI. And it's important to stress at this point that I'm not trying to incite a kind of turf war between science and the humanities. One reason for hope here is that there have always been distinguished computer scientists who have resonated to the kind of humanistic vision that I'm sketching in this lecture. One of the most inspirational of these humanistic scientists was Joseph Weizenbaum. He was a professor of computer science at MIT, who in 1963 created a primitive chatbot called Eliza, which caused a minor sensation, prefiguring the bigger sensation that ChatGPT and other large language models have caused in our day. Eliza engaged in dialogue on the pattern of Rogerian psychotherapy. This is a method which echoes aspects of a patient's answer to generate a further question. So the patient says, "You are like my father in some ways." And Eliza responds, "What resemblance do you see?" Then the patient, "You're not very aggressive, but I don't think you'd want me to notice that." And Eliza says, "What makes you think I'm not very aggressive?" Well, you can imagine the potential psychodrama that ensues. Weizenbaum was alarmed by how users of Eliza projected therapeutic capabilities onto a simple program that he himself thought of primarily as a parody of therapy sessions. There's the anecdote about his secretary asking him to give her privacy so she could continue pouring out her heart to Eliza. Worse yet, articles appeared in reputable medical journals hailing Eliza as a breakthrough in psychotherapy and touting the prospect of hard-pressed clinics using improved versions of Eliza to treat hundreds of patients simultaneously. As Weizenbaum observed subsequently in an interview, quote, "I was really stunned, and the question sprung to mind. What kind of self-understanding must a psychologist have to get the idea to give a substantial part of his work to a machine? What kind of relationship did he have with his own work? How did he judge what he himself did, his own contribution to therapy sessions, when it could be replaced so easily with a simple program?" End of quote. This experience shaped a key message in Weizenbaum's classic 1976 work, Computer Power and Human Reason. The message that we should abandon the sterile exercise of trying to predict what computers will or will not be able to do in the future. Instead, he said, the primary question is whether there are objectives that are not properly assignable to machines. To this ethical question, he gave the answer that, quote, "There are some human functions for which computers ought not to be substituted. It has nothing to do with what computers can or cannot be made to do. Respect, understanding, and love are not technical
problems, unquote. Now, I want to spend the rest of this lecture reflecting on a more specific version of Weizenbaum's question. Not the question, are there things which computers should not be permitted to do, but do we have a human right that certain decisions be taken by fellow humans rather than by AI-enabled technology? An urgent question is whether the AI revolution we're living through requires a commensurate revolution in our human rights thinking. This is a huge question with many aspects, but one aspect of that revolution would be the recognition of a novel right that limits the decision-making power of machines over us, a right justified in the name of human dignity, whose locus is the human capacity for rational autonomy. This is one of the genuinely novel ethical questions posed by AI, whereas many of the other questions around privacy and work perhaps are not novel in that sense. AI simply exacerbates an existing situation. It's a novel question because we have never previously had a remotely credible and systematic alternative to human decision-making. Now, the existence of a right to a human decision is not purely a matter of philosophical speculation, but a nascent political and legal reality. Article 22 of the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, sets out a qualified right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated reasoning or processing. Meanwhile, the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, published by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy last year, states that individuals should be able to opt out from automated systems in favor of a human alternative, where appropriate. So remarkably, both the libertarian United States and the Napoleonic European Union appear to be converging on a right to a human decision as a key element of the regulation of AI. So I'm now, in this lecture, going to focus on not what the law is, but rather on whether there is a moral case for recognizing such a human right. Of course, there may be other sorts of reasons for not subjecting people to an automated decision. For example, if a person turns over the running of his love life to ChatGPT, this may be unromantic or even perverse, but it wouldn't necessarily violate anyone's human rights. So I'm thinking about it from the human rights perspective. And if we are speaking of a human right, this must mean that there are duties or obligations that the right imposes on others. So what is the content of the duties imposed by a right to a human decision? In the abstract, I think they would take three main forms. First, a duty to allow people to opt out of an automated decision-making procedure. Second, a duty to allow them to appeal to a human from an automated decision-making process. And thirdly, a duty not to subject humans to an automated decision, full stop, irrespective of their preferences on the matter. Now, it's highly unlikely that the right to a human decision would apply to all decisions that might conceivably be delegated to an AI system. Consider, for example, automated traffic lights or automated queuing systems. These may be too trivial to come under the right to a human decision. Much of the challenge in defending such a right consists in giving a principled account of the range of decisions to which it applies, and also in explaining why other existing rights can't adequately handle those cases. So which are the decisions to which such a right might apply? Well, perhaps the decision to deprive a human of their life, we're thinking about lethal autonomous weapons, or the decision to sentence them to imprisonment, or the decision to hire or fire them, or the decision to admit them to university. No doubt you can think of other candidates. Because as a philosopher, I don't think my views have any special authority in answering the question of which decisions such a right would apply to. I want to say something instead about the general framework for addressing this problem. If we're to defend a right to a human decision, we need to know what the case is for delegating decisions to automated systems in the first place. For
For the purposes of illustration, I'm going to focus on the idea, particular case, using AI systems to make decisions that are now made by judges in court proceedings. Again, this is no mere fantasy. The Chinese government, for one, has made a huge effort to bring AI technology to bear on judicial decision-making. Often, this is ostensibly as a tool for assisting human judges, but the line between assisting and delegating can be a blurry one, in part because of the phenomenon of automation bias, whereby human decision-makers systematically defer to AI systems, even if in theory the final decision rests with them. So why would anyone suppose there might be good reason to have AI judges? I think there are three main sorts of arguments. The first line of argument is based on efficiency. It's one thing to have rights as a formal matter of law, it's quite another thing to have the effective power to uphold them in practice. And among the great obstacles to people upholding their legal rights are the expense of accessing the legal system and the massive delays to which legal systems are prone. In India, for example, the backlog of legal cases is 30 million. In Brazil, it is 80 million. And that's leaving aside all the cases that are never initiated to begin with because of a lack of legal knowledge or the prohibitive cost of litigation. It is against this background that the OECD estimates that only 46% of the world's population lives under the protection of the rule of law. AI-based systems, according to leading law and technology experts like Richard Susskind, can help reduce the yawning gap between paper rights in law and real rights that can be enforced by tremendously lowering the cost of litigation while speeding it up exponentially. So efficiency is one ground. Second ground for algorithmic decision-making is consistency. And this argument has been made most powerfully by Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, Olivier Sibony, and Cass Sunstein, great legal scholar, in their important book, Noise, a Flaw in Human Judgment. Noise is their term for the phenomenon of unwanted variability, inconsistency in judgments. They contrast noise with bias. Bias involves systematic error in one direction. Someone who is biased against female candidates or biased in favor of middle-class candidates. Noise is a matter of judgments being unacceptably all over the place. Noise can be exhibited in the judgments of a single decision maker. Maybe they're harsh pre-lunch when sentencing, lenient post-lunch, or they can be exhibited amongst different decision makers, some of whom are lenient, some of whom are harsh, leading to noise within the system as a whole. Now, a conspicuous example of the latter kind of noise, noise in the system as a whole, cited by the authors, is the United States asylum process. Highly consequential decisions where at one extreme, one judge admitted 5% of asylum seekers. At the other extreme, another judge admitted 88% of applicants. The authors claim that this kind of inconsistency amounts to an excruciating form of unfairness, a kind of lottery that is potentially a human rights violation itself. Now, one touted benefit of algorithmic decision-making is that it's noiseless. As Sunstein puts it, an algorithm with identical source code will not produce a different result in different cases. Human judgment, by contrast, will inevitably be plagued by the phenomenon of noise. Finally, third argument for delegating to AI systems, and that is the argument from the content of their decisions, to the effect that we can look forward to the day when decisions reached by AI systems can be just as good, if not better, in their substantive content than those that would be produced by human judges. Even if they can't do this right now, it is in principle possible that they will one day. And when this day arrives, there is no justification, according to this argument, for not deploying such systems.
This argument has been provocatively advanced by the American legal academic Eugene Volokh. He says that what matters ultimately is whether an AI tool can pass a legal version of the Turing test, i.e. whether the judgments the AI tool generates persuade a panel of expert lawyers of their correctness, at least to the same degree as judgments written by human judges. We're not there yet as a technical matter, but should we ever be, the only thing holding us back from using AI judges, he thinks, would be an irrational attachment to the familiar human-to-human version of the judicial encounter. This line of argument is buttressed by a point repeatedly made by Kahneman and his co-authors. Their point is that notwithstanding humans' deep attachment to exercising judgment, algorithms, even quite crude ones, whether they're embodied in a computer program or in an institutional procedure, almost always, they say, outperform humans due to the frailties and biases to which human judgment is prey. I'm not in a position to assess the veracity of that empirical claim, but their idea is even a simple algorithm, quite a crude one, will do better at things like deciding who to hire than quite experienced people exercising their judgment. Now, one response to these arguments, especially the third, is to dismiss them as fantasy. We are nowhere near having developed an AI system that can pass Volokh's legal Turing test. Indeed, we are all well aware of the bugs that existing AI systems display, from biases arising from unrepresentative or corrupted data, to their proneness to make spectacular errors no human being would ever make, because they lack common sense. Errors like confusing people with animals and animals with guns. Moreover, when enthusiasts tout the advantages of AI adjudicative tools, especially the way they can help us overcome human cognitive biases, they sometimes do so by illegitimately redefining the judicial task in ways that make it more tractable for AI. So, for example, the decision whether or not to grant bail will normally involve an exercise of judgment, balancing multiple considerations, not just the risk of the offender absconding or reoffending, but also the gravity of the offense with which they've been charged, the strength of the evidence against them, the impact on their dependents. But when Cass Sunstein, for example, argues for the superiority of algorithmic approaches to bail decisions, he exclusively focuses on one factor only, and that is the risk of reoffending, the predictive issue. So the problem has been altered to suit the tool, rather than the tool being adapted to the problem. A related fallacy we need to guard against is the assumption that there's always a single best answer to a given question, that reasoning is always an exercise in optimization where there's one particular optimal outcome. If our reasoning responds to a plurality of values, the possibility arises that a bounded plurality of solutions may be equally eligible, with no one solution being optimal. It'd be very hard to think, when advising your child about careers, that there is one single career that is the optimal career for that child. So sometimes what may appear to be noise is really the pluralistic verdict of reason. But these sorts of objections that I'm now putting may seem troublingly short-termist. What if the flaws as to the output of AI decision-making systems could be remedied? What if Volokh's legal Turing test were eventually passed? Would that be an end to the matter? Advocates for AI adjudicative tools adopt a relentlessly outcome-focused approach. Volokh says, consider the output, not the method. What matters is the result, not the process. In a similar vein, the UK expert Richard Susskind recommends outcome thinking, which urges us to focus not on how humans do what they do, but on the outputs and benefits they bring. End of quote. Insofar as they care about the process by which these outputs are produced, These thinkers focus on efficiency, which they believe tells overwhelmingly in favor of AI systems. Now, I believe we can breathe life into the case for a right to a human decision by focusing on aspects of the process of decision rather than just its outcome. We need both process and outcome thinking. The processes in question involve the exercise of valuable capacities that are distinctively human, and this ties them to the idea of a humanistic ethics. And I want to highlight three of these process considerations here. The first is the feature of explainability. We don't typically simply want judicial decisions that are correct, but also decisions whose rationale we can grasp. This involves a judge appealing to relevant considerations, including the applicable law, to justify their decision. The justification not only helps the litigant grasp the meaning of the official decision, it also puts them in a better position to assess that decision as law compliant or to challenge it if it's not. Moreover, it can offer some assurance to litigants that their arguments have been heard and taken into account, and that the decision was arrived at precisely because it is in accord with the law. But if we think about AI adjudicative tools based on machine learning, we encounter problems at every turn. It may be that no adequate explanation is available, even to those who created the AI system, since they cannot fully grasp why it reaches the decisions that it does, given the innumerable parameters involved and the revisions to the algorithm over time in response to new data and feedback loops. And even if there is an explanation, it may be of such daunting technical complexity as to be inaccessible to the ordinary citizens who are not versed in the science of machine learning. There's a deeper problem. Even if an explanation exists and is accessible to non-experts, there is a further question as to whether it is an explanation of the right kind, one that justifies the decision that has been made. Machine learning processes may reach the same results as human legal reasoning, but through radically different means. Machine learning AI systems, as I mentioned at the beginning, deploy a statistical process of pattern recognition, one that discerns statistical correlations in a vast amount of data, and on this basis, make classifications or predictions in relation to new cases. This can lead to a mismatch between outcome and explanation. A great example of this is the image recognition algorithm that was successful in distinguishing pictures of wolves from pictures of huskies, but it was using the presence of snow in the picture as the determining factor. Good outcome, bad process. In a similar vein, the automated system Lex Machina can predict the probability of success in US patent litigation more accurately than patent lawyers. But its predictions are not based on the law in past judicial decisions, but rather, as Susskind says, the predictions are based on data about over 100,000 past cases. About these cases. What kind of data? Features like the name of the judge, the name of the law firms and the lawyers involved, the nature and value of the claims, all things that we would think of as being incidental to determining the correct legal outcome. What's the name of the judge got to do with the correct legal outcome? It may well be that such a system has great value as a predictor of the outcome of litigation, but the explanation of its outcomes obviously does not consist in the application of existing law to the case at hand. Even if we had AI judges producing correct decisions, doing so for the right reasons remains a formidable challenge. A second procedural consideration is that AI judges are not answerable for their decision in the way that a human judge can be. The psychologist Mandy Dami reports of the criminal offenders that she has worked with, quote, even knowing that the human judge might make more errors, the offenders still prefer a human to an algorithm. They want the human touch, unquote.
Dami stresses that she herself takes an opposite view, preferring algorithmic sentencing to that provided by a fallible human being. But there is, I think, more than a grain of wisdom in the offender's craving for the human touch. As Aristotle observed, sometimes the person who lives in a house has more knowledge of it than the architect who designed it. And one aspect of this wisdom in the present case is the sense of being respected as a rational agent and having one's conduct judged by a fellow human being who can be held answerable for their decision. Subjecting criminals to punishment is a mark of respect, a tribute to their rational agency, and therefore their responsibility for their actions. A form of respect we do not extend to small children, animals, or the insane. Is it too much of a stretch to think that the fullest expression of this respect also requires that the sentencer be an agent that is capable of taking responsibility for the grave decision to subject a fellow human being to hard treatment and public censure? An AI system, by contrast, cannot take responsibility for the output generated by its algorithm. Unlike the human judge, the AI system cannot freely make a considered commitment to uphold the law or to apply the law in a given case. Of course, even in the case of AI judges, there is still human responsibility in play in the many decisions regarding the design and the deployment of the system. But this distal and diffuse responsibility is different, I think, from the direct responsibility a human judge can take for a decision in a particular case. So Kahneman and his co-authors are right to observe that human decision makers often regard algorithmic decision making as, quote, dehumanizing and an abdication of their responsibility, unquote. But rather than this being a brute psychological tendency with dubious ethical force, as they appear to suggest, we should take it seriously as the intimation of genuine intrinsic value. Of course, how much weight this value should be accorded in any given case is a further question. The third and final aspect of procedure I'm going to bundle together under the heading of solidarity. When a human stands in judgment over another human, there is a solidarity in play furnished by the fact that they both possess and have the opportunity to exercise their rational natures. In the case of legal adjudication, that is compliant with the rule of law, this takes a particularly vivid form. Legal officials reach a decision on the basis of their commitment to apply legal standards. Ordinary citizens are able to anticipate how officials are liable to impinge upon their activities by means of a corresponding grasp of those standards. The exercise of the capacity for rational autonomy possessed by officials dovetails with the operation of the same capacity on the part of citizens. Legal adjudication can in this way form a plateau on which a valuable form of mutual recognition and exercise of our rational capacities plays itself out. Nothing like this valuable form of solidarity can be found when a judge lacks these characteristics and capacities. And moreover, it's reasonable to suppose that solidarity has intrinsic value, that is to a large degree independent of the success of citizens or officials in reaching correct decisions. It is an essentially procedural consideration, though obviously one that can have its value diminished or perhaps even completely obliterated in certain circumstances. For example, if the decisions reached are systematically out of kilter with the law or the law is grossly unjust. I think this is the place to register the qualm which is often expressed, that one cannot expect mercy from a robot judge. For example, a judge of the UK Supreme Court, Lord Sales, recently conjured up the image of an AI judge as, quote, fixed and remorseless, an infernal machine, unquote, that is, among other defects, deaf to the pleas of mercy. Often the reasons given for this qualm about mercy betray a misunderstanding of the nature of mercy itself. For example, they involve the error that mercy is not based on rational considerations, or is in some special sense uncodifiable. But there is a genuine point about mercy here, in the region of the human solidarity I've been talking about. Mercy is a source of good reasons to treat someone more leniently than they deserve, reasons that are rooted in a charitable concern for their welfare. In showing mercy to another, for example, on the grounds of repentance, or on the grounds that they've been the victim of an abusive upbringing, there is a charitable response to a fellow human being, one grounded in an empathetic sentiment of there but for the grace of God go I. An AI judge, even one programmed to generate suitably merciful decisions as outputs, would not be able to participate in that empathetic sentiment, since they don't inhabit the shared human condition that it presupposes. Therefore, exactly the same merciful sentence will have a different significance depending on whether it's passed by a human or an AI judge. In the case of the latter, it cannot convey an empathetic response to the challenges that afflict those with a common human nature. Let me conclude. In this lecture, I've sketched a humanistic approach to AI ethics and indicated how, within such an approach, we might begin, and I stress it's only a beginning, to think about the shape of the right to a human decision. My suggestion is that the right will paradigmatically apply to decisions where explainability, answerability, and solidarity have enough significance for there to be a duty to offer people either an opt-out from automated decisions or an appeal to a human decision maker, or even to prohibit using an AI system to begin with. Moreover, it seems that these three sorts of considerations will have enhanced weight where the decision is a complex one, requiring the balancing of differing values, with scope for reasonable people to come to different conclusions, and where the decision is one that has a serious impact on people's interests or rights. Another consideration here is that we probably need to consider the matter holistically and not just in a case-by-case way. It may be that an aspect of the right to a human decision is a right to live in a society in which a sufficient number of consequential decisions are reserved to humans. Precisely which decisions are to be so reserved may to a large extent be a matter of societal discretion, provided that there are enough of them to stave off the prospect of a dehumanized environment in which the values of explainability, answerability, and solidarity have been traduced. Of course, one can readily imagine a skeptical response to my argument along the lines that I've unfairly contrasted AI systems as they are with an idealized picture of human decision makers, for example, judges. Now, I've tried to avoid rigging the debate by setting aside many current limitations in AI systems. But the point I wish to end on is that my argument doesn't simply depend on the actual existence of human decision makers who explain their decisions properly, are truly answerable for them, and act in a spirit of human solidarity. It also depends more fundamentally on the fact that these are qualities we can intelligibly hope for from human decision makers, but not from AI systems, and hope is a virtue. Today, of course, massive hopes, as well as many billions of dollars, are invested in AI technology. Hope that it can keep us secure, boost economic prosperity, improve our health, spare us from dangerous and menial work, deepen our scientific understanding, and so on. But it would be a terrible shame if these hopes had the effect of driving out another kind of hope, the hope of realizing those intrinsic goods that are only available in community with our fellow human beings. To quote the humanistic computer scientist Joseph Weizenbaum one more time, what people forget is, to be human, you have to be treated as human by other humans. Thank you.
Professor Tasioulas, thank you very much indeed for a very thought-provoking lecture. Some questions from me, and then, ladies and gentlemen, very much from you. Thank you for the text messages which I have received, and I will share some of them with Professor Tasioulas in a moment. We do have some roving microphones, so if you prefer to ask your question in person, just indicate and my colleagues will bring a microphone to you in the next few minutes. Professor, I was just wondering, to what extent is your voice, your thinking, being reflected on those who are going to decide where the AI technology goes. Let me give you a practical example. The Prime Minister's got this AI summit, of which he's quite proud, up near Milton Keynes next month. Are you going? Now, why do you think they don't, or let me not be too judgmental, why haven't they invited you, do you think?
Well, I've got to begin by saying that I have no expectation of being invited, but I think for any such summit to be successful, there has to be some particular focus for it.
Sure.
And I think the decision that's been taken is that the focus should be the one that the tech industry has underlined, which is the issue of existential risk. And that is no doubt a serious problem. I'm not minimizing the fact that it's a problem, but there are also other problems around AI, such as the ones we've been talking about today, and many others besides. Also opportunities, not just problems. But I think that, I guess what's happened is, I talked in the lecture a little bit about how the initial gambit of the tech industry was to say, what we need is ethics, and ethics is self-regulation. Well, that hasn't worked now because the aura that the tech industry used to have that was somehow special and somehow exempt from the logic of capitalism has faded. So now they're behaving as though they're sovereign states that come into agreements with governments about what should be done. Unfortunately, our leaders seem to be letting them play that way.
Is there a risk then that the realities of politics, such as, for instance, pursuance of growth or pursuance of efficiency in various actors of endeavour, and then the perhaps complementary ambition of the tech industry to maximise profit, means that everything you said tonight is sort of grit in that oyster towards progress? Well, that's their view they will take.
Yes, they would say that, I guess. So it's important to stress that the fact that I'm a billionaire or that I'm an AI scientist doesn't give me any particular insight into what counts as progress. So progress is a value judgment about the kind of future we want for ourselves, for our children. And their position doesn't make them any more expert on that than anyone else's. So I agree with you, there is this problem that there'll be resistance, but I think we need to have a more expansive conception of politics. And our conception of politics cannot be limited to what our official representatives in parliaments do. It includes also ordinary citizens engaging in debates about how they see their future, what they truly value. Is it limitless economic growth, or is it some more integral notion of human flourishing? I think this is how we get movements for the good. They tend not to come from above. They tend to come from bottom. If we think about the issues around climate change, this is driven by changing the consciousness of ordinary people. And I think this is also what we need in this case.
Would it be fair to say, if it's a little trivialising what you said, is that we should be bothered, we should care, we should be engaged in this? That's the important thing, isn't it?
I think that's the important thing, and then we've got to find ways in which we make the political system more responsive to these kinds of concerns. Because it's all too easy for one kind of power holder to become a member of an echo chamber with another kind of power holder, and to screen out those considerations that are coming from the ordinary populace.
Okay. To some specifics, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for these particular questions. I think you touched on the element of empathy in the illustration in the law. Is it that AI 1.0 is not very empathetic? Could AI 5.0 be much better?
This is a very good question, and all these discussions of AI bedeviled by the possibility of the goalposts moving. So on the one hand, you do want to talk about it in a way that makes some serious connection with the actual science rather than fantasy. But on the other hand, one has to be painfully aware that many predictions that philosophers and others have made about what AI can or cannot do. So there would be, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that the things that I've been saying about the distinctiveness of humans, including the rational autonomy that enables us to step back and to consider a range of options and figure out which we think is the correct one and endorse that and make a choice in light of that. There's nothing that I can say, there's no argument that I can formulate that rules out that possibility. I can only say two things about that. One is that possibility seems incredibly remote given existing science, and I'm basing that on my discussions with people who are much more aware of the science than I am. But the second thing is that it wouldn't really be human empathy. It wouldn't be empathy. You know, Wittgenstein said if a lion could talk, you wouldn't understand. What he meant is, lion's form of life is entirely different from ours. So it would be an intelligent being for sure, with the capacity for rational autonomy, but it wouldn't be a fellow human being. And to that extent, it would be a short-circuited form of empathy. I just want to add one extra thing to this. A lot of the tech world has as its goal the creation of artificial general intelligence. And if you're really going to create artificial general intelligence, then you're trying to create a machine that basically has all human cognitive capabilities, including the rational autonomy of stepping back and deciding, is this truly a goal I want to pursue? At the same time that they avow that they want to create artificial general intelligence, they also talk about this as being a really useful tool to serve human ends. That's basically saying we want to create a race of slaves. Because now you've created something with the valuable capabilities that give us our dignity, and yet at the same time you're going to treat it as an instrument. Now, clearly, I think they're smart enough to see that contradiction, but I've never heard anyone resolve that contradiction.
Okay, quick one in the judicial example you gave, where I think if I heard you right, you were advocating the human nature of the judge is something to be preserved. Would there be an option in that circumstance where, if you don't like what the human judge says, you could appeal to an AI body to judge the judge?
So I think these are the questions that we're now going to have to confront. Nothing in my talk suggested that we should never deploy AI to assist judges or even to replace judges. I think there's going to be a really fascinating kind of process we're going to have to go through. And part of it will be determined by how it is humans engage with these systems. I mean, will it turn out to be the case that human judges simply surrender their responsibility to these systems? Or will they be able to push back again? That will make a huge difference to how we integrate with these systems. So I'm not ruling out the possibility that when you look at the fact that there are these huge numbers of people locked out of the legal system, not able to access justice, that is a genuine concern. And it's so complicated because on the one hand you might think, well, if you go for the automated solution, you're just letting yourself up to the real solution, which is pour more money into the legal system.
Sure.
But I wasn't sort of denying that there could genuinely be a role in AI adjudication.
Okay. I'm doing my best to merge a few questions into one here, and that is, I think we're going back to the old garbage in, garbage out argument, which is, given the large language models and things are based on basically reading everything, let's imagine there's read everything that's ever been written in the human condition. But those who compose our history don't necessarily get it right the first time round. So if you allow the machine to read everything, you still haven't achieved perfection, whatever that is, have we? How do we allow for that? How do we allow for historians' bias, for instance, in the way they wrote their book?
Well, I think what the really sophisticated AI scientists are doing now, they're looking for ways to address these sorts of issues. So maybe you do let it read everything, but then you start proposing various filters. So one of these systems that's been created, constitutional AI, is trying to address the problem of what if the large language model ends up spouting some racist output. So it builds into the model the requirement, when you come up with your output, make sure it sounds like Martin Luther King or Gandhi. Okay? And so now you're filtering out some of the toxicity that is arising. So
it's quite a big filter though, isn't it?
It's exactly right. So this is it's quite remarkable. So there are these capabilities to be able to do this sort of thing.
The war in Ukraine is accelerating the question from the floor here, the conversation about AI and warfare, not something we've touched on thus far. But given the hollowing out of ethics described today, is the ethical debate about AI and warfare robust enough? Have we even started one, in your view?
I'm not an expert in this area, but
my own sense is when I talk to my colleagues in AI at Oxford, they are totally alarmed at the prospect of AI playing a role in warfare. Yeah. They just think the possibilities for things going spectacularly wrong are just too great. The reason goes back to the idea that AI doesn't have understanding, it doesn't have common sense, it doesn't have a picture of the world. It can make mistakes that no human would make. So it seems to me the priority there is not going to be some notion of maximizing welfare or whatever. It's going to be some minimal notion of trying to get an agreement with China and other powerful states to minimize the use of these technologies. And it's very hard to understand how we're going to do that because we're currently in a situation where there's a lot of polarization and demonization across these countries.
Are we right to embrace robotics and put that in? I mean, if you see some of the robots you can see online that are all but human, stronger probably than human beings.
I think it's a case-by-case answer. I mean, very different if you're using something defensively as opposed to using it to attack. Very different if you've got some human in the loop versus a decision that you can't control. I think you have to look at these things on a case-by-case basis. But it just is very troubling to me if the values that drive AI are going to be the ones of military competition.
Okay. Let me not steal your... If you've been bursting to ask a question, do put your hand up if you'd like to right now, as we are reaching the end of our time. But let me, share another one which has come in via the text messaging, so thank you for that. Do we have to, in order to better interface with artificial intelligence, have a better understanding or a better definition of what it is to be a human being?
That's right. I think this is absolutely right. And one of the dangers that is now happening, I did mention in the lecture that some of the advocates of AI redefine the problems in order to make them more tractable for AI. One of the problems that happens when big corporations say, artificial general intelligence is just around the corner, they're reducing human capacities in order to be able to make that claim. So they're denaturing our humanity in order to say, well, we're quite like these systems that we're creating. So we have to revisit, to make the most of AI, we have to revisit what we find valuable about being human. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that we need to do to make the most of AI is to increase digital literacy in the population. So here, Taiwan is a great example. Taiwan has been a country that has been very effective in using AI technology to enhance democratic political participation. People go onto a platform, they engage in debate, and this feeds itself into actual legislation in the country because the AI system is able to sort of crystallize the output of these debates. But that relies upon having an informed and digitally literate public. So
might be a better way of deciding whether to build a high-speed rail line, for instance.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Professor John Tasioulas, thank you so much indeed. Thank you. Professor, thank you. And now, Gary McEwen, the Programme Director here at the House, will offer our vote of thanks. Gary?
Thank you, Professor Tasioulas. Thank you for such an intelligent lecture. Martin, thank you for such a stimulating interview. And thank you to those of you who submitted questions. It would be a very brave man, woman, or indeed robot who would try to summarize such a stimulating lecture. But I do know that I certainly, many of you here tonight, and many who weren't able to be with us, will revisit your lecture on the St. George's House website. It's been a terrific evening. The Elson Ethics lecture has a very distinguished pedigree, and you have certainly enhanced that pedigree this evening. Let us now make our way to the Dean's Cloister for a drinks reception, but before we do that, please join me in thanking one last time Martin Stanford for his interviewing skills and our lecturer this evening, Professor John Tasioulas.